Hello, and welcome to a build guide update for Surgeon General's Eye of Winter brand recall Triggerbot Assassin in Path of Exile patch 3.22 Trial of the Ancestors. When I released my full guide, I received a number of requests for a version of the build that didn't require Mageblood or luxury upgrades. This version of the build contains all the same mechanics as shown in the full investment guide, but on a budget of approximately 65 divines at the time of recording. This version is capable of all standard mapping content and has sufficient damage and defenses for endgame bosses. The footage playing in the background is from a Tier 16 Alcan Go map with all increased effective map modifiers Atlas passives. This version of the build has an estimated 20 million damage per second against bosses and reasonable clear speed from its wide area projectile spam and Herald of Ice explosions. This build can be used to try out the playstyle and farm towards upgrades towards the full investment version, which has about 5 times more damage. In this video, I will briefly cover the mechanics that we're taking advantage of, but there is a more in-depth explanation in the full build guide, which you can access by clicking on the card showing in the bottom right or by following the link in the video description below. The major focus of the video will be showing the passive tree changes and suggestions for the gear that you'll need. I've also provided a checklist towards the end of the video to follow as you're assembling the gear for your character. To overview the character, I rate the offense of this version of the build at an 8 out of 10. We have close to screen-wide coverage and corpse explosions, which make mapping feel fluid, but thanks to returning projectiles, we can also focus that damage down to a respectable 20 million boss DPS. On the defensive side, I rate the build at a 7 out of 10. It's pretty straightforward to reach 100% spell suppression, and we have an additional 30% elemental damage reduction on top of our standard resistances. The build's biggest weakness is its low defenses against physical damage. However, a reasonable amount of evasion on top of a very high life and energy shield recovery makes most endgame content easy. I always attempt to work in this list of quality of life features into my builds. At the 65 divine budget, I had to settle on dropping permanent phasing, reflect immunity, and curse immunity. The build has about 100% increased movement speed when flasks are up. During mapping, your flash should always be active, but you will have closer to 40% movement speed when in your hideout or bossing. This build takes advantage of the interaction between Eye of Winter and Arcanist brand with returning projectiles from Nimbus. For a complete explanation, see the full build guide, but the important thing to understand is that when triggered by Arcanist brand, the maximum range of the Eye of Winter projectile is limited, and therefore it is able to return to the character's position before dissipating. Because of this, we are able to use our own character's positioning to benefit from the end-of-flight mechanics built into the Eye of Winter gem and to target the large number of projectiles that we're generating. This comparison shows how the combination of Arcanist brand and Nimbus is able to focus the projectiles generated by Eye of Winter. By standing on top of the enemy, we can force most of the shard projectiles to hit, whereas when using Eye of Winter alone, they fly off in all directions. To build upon this tech, we use a chain triggering mechanic. The build uses Triggerbots, which doubles the activation of any triggered skill. Since Arcanist brand counts as triggering spells, all activations of Eye of Winter are doubled. Furthermore, we can place brand recall in a weapon with the mod Trigger a Socketed Spell on using a skill. The Skitterbots will double this instance of brand recall, which will activate all of our brands. This chain of trigger events contains several multipliers, which altogether results in us creating over 800 projectiles per second. This skill comparison shows how chain triggering with Triggerbots is used to multiply the number of Eyes of Winter that we generate. Our chain triggers create 28 Eyes of Winter each time brand recall comes off cooldown, about every 1.5 seconds. By creating so many projectiles, we've gained large multipliers to both our damage and our life and energy shield recovery. If you have questions about either the Arcanist brand or chain triggering tech used in this build, please refer to the full build guide or ask in the comments section. Brand recall spends a portion of the mana cost every time it activates a brand. With our sequence of chain triggering, these mana costs would quickly get out of control, so it is crucial to reduce the mana cost of our skills to 0. In the Mageblood version of the build, we use a reduced mana cost flask with increased effect, resulting in 48% reduced cost from this source alone. Without Mageblood, we have to find alternate sources to replace this 48%. To do so, we take an extra couple passive points in the radius of our Timeless Jewel. Additionally, we can craft 5% reduced mana cost as a prefix on our rare ring. Finally, we make significant changes to our pathing on the tree to pick up the Righteous Decree and Dreamer wheels. Along with the small nodes near these notables and the Mana Mastery, we've exactly made up the missing mana cost reductions, resulting in 0 mana cost for Brand Recall and Arcanist Brand. Here are the changes that have been made to the passive tree. I'm showing a level 94 tree that has all offensive and defensive mechanics for the final build in place. The two major changes that have been made are the inclusion of the mana reduction wheels in the bottom left and center of the tree. The pathing for the mana reduction costs us 18 passives, but the passives we pick up along the way are useful for the build: Energy Shield, some all resist, and elemental damage. From the full investment build, we've had to spec out of passives in these areas, dropping a Jewel Socket, 1 maximum power charge, some crit scaling, and mana reservation for an aura. The Path of Building link for this tree is in the description below. I've also included a minimally viable passive tree for a level 71 character. This tree just barely fits in all the necessary mechanics for the build. At this level, you won't be able to cap your suppression, and your life and defenses will be low relative to the final build, but the build's mechanics will be online enough, allowing you to switch just after completing the campaign. This passive tree is also linked in the description. The Path of Buildings include gearing suggestions on the item page. I've limited all suggested gear to only include 3 or 4 useful mods and no tier 1 mods. You're mostly just looking for items with good mixes of life, suppression, resists, and attributes. While purchasing, remember that you can always swap elemental resistances on the harvest bench, and don't forget to craft a mod on any pieces with an open affix. Your rare jewelry, shield, and gloves should all be only a few divines. You'll likely need to roll your own implicits on the gloves. Note that we're replacing Mageblood with a Stygian Vise to make room for an Abyss Jewel that can be used to cap your chance to avoid shock. Your boots and helmet will likely need to be self-crafted. We need a specific amount of shock avoidance on our boots alongside the brittle implicit, and you're unlikely to find a suitable version on trade. Instead, buy a dexterity base with a fractured life or movement speed prefix, then roll Essences of Torment until you hit a reasonable level of suppression. Then use the crafting bench to craft the prefix you didn't have fractured. You will also have to craft your helmet in order to have access to the Eye of Winter enchant. Make sure to select a dexterity base in order to have access to suppression rolls, then simply use life, resist, or attribute essences to roll for 4 good mods. Finish the helm by crafting physical damage taken as fire on the bench and crafting Eldritch Implicits of your own choosing. Both of these items should cost you well under 3 divines to craft. You should also always craft your own flasks. Remember that you can sell any good rolls that aren't the ones you're looking for. To craft your trigger wand, purchase a spell damage or cold damage to spells base with fractured projectile speed. Spam Veiled Chaos Orbs until you receive a Veiled Suffix. If there's room for another suffix, you'll want to benchcraft a damage over time multiplier mod to block mods before unveiling. Unveil at Jun, looking for the trigger mod. This may take several tries, and if Jun doesn't offer the trigger mod, you'll need to restart at the beginning. Once you get the correct unveil, craft a spell damage prefix and your trigger weapon is finished. You can improve this process, but at a significantly higher cost. For a crafting guide for a more expensive version, see the full investment guide. The largest cost in your build will be Nimbus for returning projectiles. The rest of the required uniques should be under a couple divines. The price of Eternal Damnation varies considerably depending on how much chaos resist you want. When picking a lore weave, make sure to buy one with 78% resists. The Forbidden Jewels are obviously mandatory to access Triggerbots. These are low availability, but at the time of recording, there were a few dozen available for under 2 divines. Your Timeless Jewel should be relatively inexpensive. The reduced mana cost per devotion affix is mandatory, but the other is optional. The best option is probably the Elemental Resistance to help reach your cap. Make sure to check the jewel number in Path of Building prior to purchasing to ensure that the jewel won't transform a required node. A Watcher's Eye isn't strictly necessary for the build, but the Grace Suppression mod will help you reach 100% spell suppress, and it is relatively inexpensive. Your cluster jewels can be purchased for under a divine each. 4 passive, streamlined aerodynamics clusters are inexpensive beyond the start of the league. Large cluster jewels with 3 good notables are expensive, but you can just start with a cluster that has the 2 notables and upgrade later. Finally, you will need to purchase 3 copies of Divergent Inspiration. Make sure to get uncorrupted or 2020 corrupted versions, or your mana costs will be incorrect. You'll also need a Divergent Arcanist brand for the additional projectile speed that it provides. Adding up all these costs, I estimate the total investment to get this version of the build off the ground at 62 divines, leaving a few divine in the budget for unlucky crafting streaks or luxury upgrades. I've included a short checklist of items to verify before you start playing the build. I would suggest purchasing gear incrementally and importing items into Path of Building along the way to verify that you're meeting attribute and resist requirements. Don't forget to check your projectile speed for Eye of Winter on the Calculations tab. Finally, verify that you have correctly set up your mana costs by checking that your Arcanist brand and brand recall mana costs are 0, and that Convocation has a mana cost of 1. I will close this guide update with a demonstration in a Tier 16 map. To play the build, you will place Convocation on left click and put your Arcanist brand on right click. At the start of the map, spam Arcanist brand a few times to get your brands out, then simply run through the map going through the packs. Periodically cast Arcanist brand to refresh their duration. You will also want to cast your Divine Hatred Blessing every 11 seconds to keep that damage buff on you. For bosses, you will simply cast your 2 curses on them, stand on top of them, and keep refreshing your Arcanist brands. I've also included a showcase of an endgame boss to demonstrate that even this budget version of the build can quickly and easily delete bosses. I hope you find this version of the build useful. If you have any questions about the build, please refer to the in-depth guide or ask in the comments section below. The video description has Path of Building links and a link to the forum text guide, which will be completed soon. If you have enjoyed the guide or are interested in more content of this type, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support.